Thank you all for welcoming us this evening. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So it's no secret that just simply being around people who are different from us makes us more creative, more diligent, and harder working. Organizational scientists, psychologists, sociologists, economists have proven that socially diverse groups, that is, those with a diversity of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and age, are more innovative and productive than homogenous groups of individuals. This is not only because people with different backgrounds bring new information. Simply interacting with individuals who are different forces group members to prepare better, to anticipate alternative viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus will take effort. The benefits to business also involve customer service. A Harvard Business Review study in 2014 indicated that when at least one member of a team has traits in common with the end user, the entire team better understands that user. And so a team with a member who shares a client's ethnicity or other traits is over 150% likelier than another team member to understand that client. And this also pertains, the benefits also pertain to retention and turnover, productivity, corporate responsibility, and financial performance. So that's why we're having this conversation today. While Rochester shines as an innovation hub in technology, the demographics of our highest paid professional classes do not reflect the demographics of our community as a whole. We as leaders must come together and do better, or else our economy will suffer as we compete with other geographic areas for talent and jobs and investment. And with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists this evening. To my right is Victoria Van Voorhis, and I call her Tori, as do many of you in the room. Victoria Tori is the founder and CEO of Second Avenue Software, Inc., or Second Ave Learning, an award-winning educational game studio that has been producing educational games and interactives for over 13 years, and it goes far beyond games and interactives. Their products have over 30 million playthroughs of science, games, and simulations in 31 countries. And Tori's company has launched games on a number of platforms, including Nintendo Switch. And her company was awarded a major grant this past year to create applications for the centennial of women's suffrage, which is really exciting. Dr. Deanna Kimbrel, I call her Dee, many of you do as well, is a scholar practitioner in the field of leadership and organizational design. Dee has worked as a diversity and inclusion practitioner, educator, entrepreneur, and administrator for the majority of her career, and some of her highlights and strengths include organizational strategy, leadership development, consulting, public speaking, coaching, and corporate training. Right now, we're fortunate that Dee leads diversity and inclusion for one of our region's largest private employers, Paychex. So she acts as simultaneously, she acts as a speaker and consultant for other organizations and runs an online boutique, in addition to being a single mom and a mentor in the community. And her passions for D&I evolved from personal experiences and professional experiences, which we're going to talk about tonight. Finally, Kevin Beckford is here. Kevin is the staff director of equity and inclusion at the University of Rochester, the #1 private employer in our region and across upstate New York. Kevin is also a council member for the town of Pittsford, so is a public servant serving our communities. He's the first African American to hold elective office in Pittsford in its 200-plus year history, so that's significant. So can I have a round of applause, please, for our panelists? So to keep things tight this evening, I've simplified the questions to just 3, and each of our panelists will be asked to answer each of those 3 questions individually, and they're broader based, so you're going to hear some color commentary that will help further color our conversations later on this evening. So my first question, and we can just go straight from you, Tori, to Dee, to Kevin. In your roles in business and as active members of the Rochester community, how might you describe the importance of representation as it pertains to positive outcomes?
That's a really broad question. I don't know. So the first thing I want to say in answer to that is, first, I'm a cisgendered female from an upper middle class background. So I'm going to just put out there that I've got a ton of privilege, and it's something that I've been aware of since I was a little kid, and I try to do my best. So, I just want to make sure that that's clear. When we design our educational products, we don't have a choice about who the end learner is. We actually have to design for everyone. And representation there is super important. And there are things that you might not think about when you're designing a product. Socioeconomic status is a huge factor in the design of an educational intervention, whether or not you're designing for a little kid or for an adult. It matters. Race and ethnicity are really difficult terms, and I think they're charged terms, but if you don't have a thoughtful array of people on your team and you're not taking those factors into account during design, you're going to fail. And we'll talk a little bit about that more when we get to when we talk about design. And then the other thing that I want to talk about is sexual orientation and or gender representation. And there's some other things that we can talk about in terms of just general ability. But if you aren't thinking about the diversity of your users and your end products, you can exclude people by not including them. And how many people here have ever played The Sims? All right. And Will Wright, if you haven't, you should go over to the Strong Museum's archives. Will Wright, when he built The Sims, he was an amazing game designer. And in the marginalia of one of his design docs for The Sims, he just wrote same-sex marriage equals love. And in that one moment, he made a design choice to make that possible in The Sims. And so that allowed kids who were playing these Sims or young adults who were playing them to actually envision themselves. And that just moment of insight created a whole opportunity for kids to see themselves represented in games. And before that, like there was Caper and the Castro in the early 80s, and that's about it for LGBTQ representation in games. So it's when you're thoughtful about design and inclusion and you can represent the spectrum of people that bring themselves together, you end up with more impactful products. And it actually makes people stop and think when they're building their sim, what that might mean to choose a same-sex partner or to represent yourself differently from in a gender perspective. So that's just, we have to think about that every time we build an educational product or a serious game or a simulation or when we're designing educational content, because we don't know what kids are sitting in that classroom or at the other end of the play space that we've created.
Okay. Thanks, Tori. I think she said it all. Very good. But I would just also add on to that, representation is very important. In our business, in our industry, when I think about bringing people into the organization, one of the biggest problems we have is the war on talent. So making sure that we are able to attract and retain a diverse population. And in that aspect, I think that representation is very important because people are looking for people that look like them in the organization. So they know that there's someone that will be able to have a voice for them if they don't have one, and also that they have opportunity throughout the organization. So I think that when there is proper representation of differences, people that are different will be more attracted and more likely to stay within the organization because they feel like they have a voice and then they feel like they have opportunity.
I'm going to give a little bit of an additional sort of spin on this from a government perspective. So with my, when I got elected to office, I didn't know when I was running until I got on the ballot. And they said, you're going to be the first. And I said, first what? So I kind of thought we had done that already, and, as far as a little bit of background on me, I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and I spent about 18 years in the Bahamas Islands. So my Dad was an engineer and was recruited by the Bahamian government, and so I lived in the Bahamas from about 3 years old until 18. So my entire social construct is based on very different than what you're used to here in the United States, and I've lived here for 30 years now, and I summarily reject the social construct that I have to live with every day. And what do I mean by that? I grew up where the governor of the island, the prime minister, doctor, lawyer, homeless person in the market all look like me. So color was not something that we ever talked about. When we describe people, we never even mentioned that. We would, big, tall, slim, we would use every descriptor except for that because it was a non-issue. So I grew up not even mentioning that. And then for every one native person on the island, we had about 2 to 3 people from all over the world. So I grew up with having people that looked from everywhere you can think of as part of the human, sort of condition, like who we are, the global citizen. And so I grew up with an appreciation in such a way that when I got off the plane here, no one gave me a memo that said, just so you know, heads up, some of the things you're used to doing as a person, as a human, in this case here could get you killed, all right, or hurt or harmed, or you may find doors unopened. And so it took many years. Sometimes people thought I was courageous, and I'm sure there's courage there, but most of it was naiveness. I just didn't know, and that was my secret weapon. So I actually, would make people uncomfortable because they were sort of like, "Hey, didn't you get the memo? You're not supposed to be in this room or in this meeting, or you shouldn't, feel this confident, or all these things that when you don't have microaggressions that you have to live with every single day, as a kid all the way to an adult, it affects you. So I have to share that with you because that's my sort of lived experience, and it affects everything that I do. So when I look at the world around me every day, I wake up, I had to learn things that needed to keep me safe, to be able to make sure that until the social construct changes, and sadly after 30 years, it hasn't changed much, to be honest with you. But here's why representation matters. So when I found out and they said, you're going to be the first, I started doing a little bit of digging to say, okay, so that tells me we have a board. We have 30,000 people live in our town. We're the most affluent town in Monroe County. The average per household income for Monroe County is about $57,000. For people of color, African Americans specifically, it's $29,000 per household. In Pittsford, it's $108,000 per household. So I said, okay, all right, so that's it. That's a little bit of the frame. I looked at diversity of our residential base, 2% African American, 2%, right? 10 minutes away, high percentage, right? So I thought, okay, so that means that I need to make sure I'm responsible for this position I'm going to take to bring my lived experience to help create meaningful and not just change, but sustainable systemic change, right? So here's what I discovered. We were the only town that never issued a proclamation to Martin Luther King. Most people didn't know that. Not because they didn't want to. Nobody asked. Representation matters. So I was sworn in on the 3rd of January 2018. The very first thing I asked for was I'd like us to issue a proclamation to Martin Luther King to celebrate the life and legacy of Martin Luther King. First response was, sure, no problem. Representation matters. So not only did we have our first proclamation, I had every board member read it, and we have 5 board members read one paragraph from that. My next request was I want this to be framed and put in perpetuity in the Pittsford Library forever. So when that building comes down, that comes down. And I want to put it in a high traffic area. So if you visit the Pittsford Library today, the new book section, there's a column to the right of it, you'll see that proclamation. A year later, Samra Brooke, some of you know, she's running for Senate, her family, the Brooke family, and a number of volunteers within Pittsford, we ended up creating a 4-day Martin Luther King Living the Dream series in 2019, a year later. And we couldn't get the town to fully fund it because they weren't sure if it would work. So our families and a couple other folks, we funded the first one, proved the concept. The very next month, I brought it back to the board and said, I'd like us to adopt this. If we have the duck drop every year, we have the food truck rodeo every year, We're going to have a cultural event every year. So it was approved unanimously. So in 2020, we had a 5-day Martin Luther King Living the Dream series. So every night there's something different, a movie night and discussion about race. And it includes people from all over Monroe County. Representation matters. And there's more things I'll share a little bit later if we have time. But these are things that I think that if we're not in the room, that's one thing. When you're in the room, to be able to use your agency, position, and power for good. We have folks that sometimes are in the room, but they're not doing anything other than saying, "Woo, I'm here." I want to make sure that I pave the way for meaningful systemic change.
Thank you, Kevin. The next question is, I'm going to ask you for some insights and some ideas. What are some examples of structural changes, both within institutions and in the public arena or arenas, that can lead to positive change, necessary change for Rochester, New York, with regard to inclusion and diversity? Another broad one, but structural changes.
Well, I can start with what we do inside our company. And we moved the company downtown because we wanted to be part of this community. And we wanted to model that there was innovation happening. And I wanted to have some of those creative collisions that Tom talked about. We work very hard to make sure that our team is diverse across a whole set of vectors, right? Racial diversity, gender diversity. We have worked with RIT to have kids who are on the autism spectrum co-op in our office so that they have exposure to the workplace and that our team members have experience in working with people on the autism spectrum. So first and foremost, make sure that you have representation, to Kevin's point, at your table. Second, our design protocols for everything that we build, that sort of diversity and representation is one of the first questions that we ask ourselves. And then as we're doing our design and testing, we actually create design and test protocols that require us to test with urban, suburban, and rural cohorts. And we make sure that we have gender balance. And we do that whether or not we're designing for adults or little kids or teenagers or somewhere in between. And in doing that, we find out amazing things. And I'm going to tell you a little story. We got a grant from the National Science Foundation a few years ago to build a product that we call Martha Madison. It's an award-winning STEM product. And I started out with the idea that I wanted to improve STEM outcomes for girls, because it's not great in this country. It's not great in a lot of places for women in STEM. And so we designed these games to be cooperative, because that's important in terms of play for girls. Cooperative play is better than competitive. And we situated science in social context. You're doing good, right? And there's a reason that science is important, right? Like if you learn chemistry, you might cure cancer. If you want to help somebody out, you might need to build a bridge. It was all designed to situate the learning of science in context. And so we tested with urban, suburban, and rural kids. We had over-the-shoulder video cameras. We looked at all the data, and we did pre-posts, right? We did sort of an assessment before and an assessment after. And I got to my post-assessment with my urban kids. We used a cohort of kids from the 19th Ward Boys and Girls Club. And I felt like I had failed. I was like, there was no difference on the pre-post in terms of the standardized assessment items. And I was like, I totally failed these kids. I did it wrong. And then we started digging into the data even more. And what we discovered was that these kids didn't have a lot of preconceptions about science, because, to be quite frank, the RCSD does a very poor job of teaching science. Apologies to anybody from the RCSD in here. But the solutions that they generated in the games were more creative and more innovative. They anticipated solutions to the puzzles that our PhD physicists never planned, right? And I was like, huh. And then, because we'd rolled videotape, I watched the videotape and we had some grad students code it. And you would think that this would be Captain frickin' obvious, right? And I'm watching them play, and this happened to be a simple machines puzzle that we asked them to play with. And they were like, oh, you got to put the ramp thingy over there, man. No, you got to go. It's got to go there. And that's when I had my aha moment. They were referring to the ramp thingy, and all the pre-post tests refer to an inclined plane. And these kids just did not have the language of science. And I would not have had that aha moment if I hadn't created that test. And I'll tell you, we had a whole different set of aha moments when we tested with the rural kids, right? We could go down that path a different night. But when we refactored the game, and we did this, like, I don't know if you remember the movies from the 50s where they would like subliminally flash popcorn on the screen before the movie started. We took a page out of that book and we flashed things like convex lens and showed a picture of it, or inclined plane. And then the kids thought that they were getting secret hints and tips in the game, and they started, because it was cooperative, using the language of science to play the game. And so after we did that, we did pre-post tests, and we showed a full letter grade improvement with no teacher intervention just by playing the game. And what happens is, when kids learn language through play, they internalize it. And so then when the teacher is standing up there lecturing, it's not want, inclined plane, want. They're like, oh, it's that thing in the game. And those cognitive hooks have been set. And so, not all of you get to design serious games for a living. So, I feel really bad for you. But when you're doing design, you have to invite people to the table that reflect the participants, right? You have to engage with those kids as part, for us it's kids or adults or whomever, to make sure that you're anticipating their needs in your design. And you have to know that you're going to get it wrong sometimes and learn and make it better. We've gone on to do testing with Derek Coley. I don't know if he's here tonight. I don't see him. He runs the Safe to Be Smart program through the Rochester Public Library. We've got game changers, and we invite kids to come in and play test and play games in our office all the time. But just know that you're going to get it wrong. Be willing to be wrong and make it better, but make sure that you invite the right people to the table or to the experience.
Thank you. I love that story. I can talk to you guys about what we do at Paychex since I've been there. So I've been leading the diversity and inclusion structure at Paychex for the last year and a half. So when I came into the organization, we didn't even have a commitment, right? So there was nothing, there was no structure, there was no commitment, there wasn't anything organizational around diversity and inclusion. Although things have happened in little pockets throughout the organization. Now, Paychex is a 16,000 person organization throughout the country and in some international countries as well. So some things that may be happening in our Charlotte location or in our Rochester location, nobody kind of knew about it. So nothing was centralized and there was no commitment. So it was just employees trying to get things from off the ground here and there when they had time. So when I was brought into the organization, I started off with creating a commitment. So Tori, you talked about language, right? So we wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we were committed in the language around that. So to educate people on the language, we created a training, an enterprise-wide training to make sure that everybody in the organization gets at the same time. That training was broken up into the definition of diversity and inclusion. As we know, there's all different definitions for I&D based on our experiences, right? So we started off with a textbook definition, but also informed people about the different identities and how those different lenses kind of shape how we experience diversity and inclusion. And this is particularly important for leaders to understand because these are the ones that are making decisions and implementing changes throughout the organization. So from there, we implemented the training. So it's a 4-part training. And then we also looked at how we bring people into the organization. So a series of different interventions or structural changes on how we do things. So Paychex is about a 40-year-old company, right? So a lot of our systems and the way that we do things is 40 years old, right? So let's think about what was happening 40 years ago. And we don't want to bring people into the organization that way. So some of the things that we implemented was diverse panels. So again, representation, different ideas and perspectives matter. So we looked at for our manager and above levels where there was very low representation, we would implement diverse panels and make sure that there is a diversity in thought when we're bringing or moving leaders throughout the organization. And that's just one thing in the hiring process. We work to train our talent acquisition managers and our hiring managers on bias, right? So that's the biggest thing that gets in the way of inclusion is bias. So we have a lot of biases. And what usually happens is people are selecting people because they remind them of themselves, right? They're just like me. They're going to be great for the team. So working to ensure that we're training people to not think that way and think about differences. So what are the uniquenesses that people can bring that we need to have on the team? Traditionally, we looked at that in a more proactive way. So after teams are made up, we say, oh, this team is pretty much the same. We need some diversity, which is too late because we're not going to fire people in the name of diversity. So working with the leaders on how to think about that proactively and building teams and bringing people into the organization. And we know that biases are hard to get over in the moment. So we are kind of working with them to have those hard stops in the process before decisions are made. We're also looking at promotion. So how do we move people through the organization? We know that some people, because of those same biases, get overlooked. So we're creating pipelines that prepare people and put them in the position for different roles and leadership roles throughout the organization, especially women and people of color. And then we look at the environment. So what are the benefits that we're offering to make inclusion and diversity tangible? What makes inclusion and diversity tangible to people is going to be the opportunity that they have to thrive, right? So we want to make sure that we have benefits to give people those opportunities. So when I'm training, I always say, what's fair? Who can answer that question here? What's fair? When we think about fair, what is that? Who can give me their definition of fair?
I'll say equal pay for equal work is a big piece of that, right?
Absolutely. Equal pay
No
for
matter
equal
what
work,
you look
right?
like and where you come from, and right.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing, and that's the hardest question for leaders to answer, and these are the people that are making fair decisions every day. And I say, well, what is fair? And I'm like, eh. So what fair is we want to give people what they need in order to be successful. It's not going to be the same thing for everybody, but giving everybody what they need. And that's our benefits and resources. So if we don't even know, if our leaders don't know what our benefits and resources are, how can they be fair in the process of giving people what they need? So it's number one, making people aware of the benefits that we offer, because we have a lot, and then also making sure that they have access to those benefits and that they're able to be fair in the workplace. Another thing is teaching leaders, and I think that I know that our diversity and inclusion strategy is really focused on leadership. So we want to make sure that the leaders are the ones implementing the strategy. I'm only one person to 16,000 people. So I cannot go to every work environment and implement diversity and inclusion. It's really up to the leaders to do that. And one thing we focus on the leaders being able to do is coach through a lack of inclusion or issues related to inclusion and diversity, like microaggressions. So we teach them what microaggressions are, and then how do we coach in regards to intent versus impact. And it's important in regards to saving relationships as well as our culture. So we work with leaders on how to identify that. Of course, people won't come into the office and say, oh, it's a microaggression going on today, right? They're not going to say that. They're going to say people are being disrespectful, people are, different things like that. So how do we identify what the issues are? And then how do we coach through that to save relationships, to save communication, and also to grow our culture as well? So I think that there's a lot of things that an organization must do, but the number one thing an organization must do is make a commitment, and that's something that we've done at Paychex. And it started with our CEO, vocalizing that, why diversity and inclusion is important, why it's important to everyone, and then a brief idea of what it looks like. So it really starts at the top with the commitment and then several structural things.
Thank you. So one of the things, I'll share this before I share the practical example. I have to explain to you a little bit of how it influenced, why when I talk about being in the room to be able to direct change, it has to do with your lived experience, right? So for example, when I was going through college, I worked 3 jobs. I washed dishes, cleaned the bathroom, vacuumed, that was one job in the restaurant. I worked at a dry cleaning, Dr. K's Cleaners in Henrietta, if you know that. I used to take the clothes in. And then I also worked at a nursing home, washing dishes on the weekend. I don't know where I got the energy to do that. I look back at it, at 55 now, I'm like, boy, how did I do that? But here's what that did. That actually informed me. So I remember working with folks that this was their career because of their life experiences, that they, in some cases, didn't get a chance to finish high school. So I had a deep, deep level of respect for every job. Martin Luther King, in one of his speeches, says we can't all be captains. Some of us have to be crew. There's something for all of us to do. And whatever you decide to do, just be the best at that. And so that I sort of had that lived experience. So why is that important? So when I got on the town board, a number of things we ended up doing. Because I have a 4-year term. I put together a 4-year strategy, and the goal was very simple. I wanted to leave behind systemic change to make sure that when I look back at it, I can say, hey, this is something that we changed the landscape. So the first budget we were going to be approving, because when you get elected, you have to absorb that budget that was approved before you got on board. So your first budget that you approve is the next year. So I sit, as part of my role at the University of Rochester, I sit on the Rochester Anti-Poverty Initiative Employment Workforce Group, and I co-chair a project on wage enhancement with ESNL, their equivalent CDO, Dr. Collier. And so I became intimately involved with understanding how poverty was affecting Rochester. 65,000 people living in poverty, 20,000 are working poor. So they're working multiple jobs, stitching together several jobs just to create a one livable wage. In fact, if you parked in the garage across the street today, anybody parked in the garage across the street? Okay, so when I walk through my life and occupy any space, I try to see people. And so the person who checked you in, who moved that red cone, as she was giving me change, I said, "How was your day?" She said, I'm exhausted. I said, "It's a long day?" She says, "Yeah, but I have another job too, so I came from that job to come here." I said, "So you have 2 jobs?" I said, "Which one's full-time?" So I'm interviewing this person, right? I said, she said, "Well, that's the full-time job. This is my second job." I said, "Would you like to have 1 job?" "Yeah, I'd love that." I said, "Here's my card. Call me. Remind me where we meet, because I do this a lot. And we'll get you in for an exploratory to see if we can get you a livable wage job." Right? Use your position, power, and agency for change. See people. I mean, she looked at me, she says, "Thank you." I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Anna." I said, "Okay." I said, "I'll look forward to your email." She says, "You mean that?" I said, "Yep." So here's the thing. When we were getting ready to approve our budget, we have a $20 million budget in Pittsford. We only have a short number of employees. We don't have thousands, at 125, and then we grow to seasonal employment. So I'll be real quick, promise. So when I took a look at it, I said, well, we have some people that are working minimum wage. We have folks working over 100,000. We have folks that are the whole spectrum. But just like any other company, we have people that are in lower skill jobs making minimum wage. I said, well, listen, because of my role on RMAPI and my lived experience of what it's like to work in those jobs, it's unacceptable to me to pay minimum wage. That was meant to be a floor, not a target. So what I'd like to propose is we take any of our employees that are below $13.50 and we move them up to $13.50. That becomes our new minimum wage, and we index it to the rest of the pay structure so that it never happens again. So do the math, find out what it would cost, and then come back and let me know. Now, we didn't have the majority position. There's only 2 of the 5 people on the board are Democrats. So if the answer was no, I lose. But I didn't frame it around politics. I framed it around humanity. They came back and said, yes, I offered the amendment. The supervisor seconded, which told his two Republican colleagues, line up behind me, and we had unanimous, no fanfare. The minimum wage in Pittsford is $13.50 now, which is, through the MIT calculator online, is the entry point for a livable wage with benefits. Yeah.
Wow, that was tremendous. So we talked about essentially incorporating humanity into everything that we do, including in business and in public service, in top-down commitment and actually building structure around education in institutions. And we talked about product design, and we're building a product, and we keep the end user in mind. Those were all tremendous insights. The final question that I'm going to, oh yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Unless, can we grab a final thought from each of the panelists? Okay. Final thoughts, any personal experiences that you'd like to share before we wrap?
I guess I would just ask you all to keep in mind, you never know who's looking at you as a role model, and make sure that you're leading like Kevin's done and like Dia's done in every opportunity. You have the power to make change.
I would just add the importance of inclusion, and I always lead with inclusion. At Paychex, we lead with inclusion, just because that's where the structure and strategy is. We're all different in one way or another, but just remember the importance can be somebody's life. Inclusion is very important. There's psychological safety issues associated with the lack of inclusion. So that little thing that you can do in your workplace, in your community to be more inclusive may save somebody's life. So inclusion is that important.
I'll leave you with this thought. When you look at any problem, like the problems we're talking about here, they look insurmountable because they're huge. You know, I've seen little change in 30 years in areas that count. There has been some change. And I think it's because we're not all in the solution. It's not it's not people of color to solve the problems of inequity. It's all of us because it's a humanity issue, right? And so to me, what I would recommend, and this is how I live my personal life, and it's my commitment, is that if you think of a problem as a bowl, and we all have cups, some of us have bigger cups than others, depending upon your role, your kind of, the agency you have. And your goal is very simple: dip it into the problem and fix that. And when your cup is empty, go back and get some more of the problem, right? And so find your cup of change. Find out what agency, position, and power you have. And to be part of the solution, and don't leave it for anybody else. Because it isn't anybody else, it's you that we're waiting for.
Excellent. Kevin Beckford, thank you. Dr. Deanna Kimbrel, Victoria Van Voorhis. Thank you all.